Good evening, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me. My name's Jake Phillips. I'm the Extension Manager at Angus Australia, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you along tonight to the first of our Angus Essentials webinar series, which is a series that we've put together at Angus Australia that'll be rolled out once a month for the next few months, which is really around the fundamentals and the essential information that you need to know in your interactions with Angus Australia, but also on-farm management of Angus cattle, in particular with breeding and genetics, and all of the touch points that you'll have with us along your journey. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I've got the pleasure to be joined by Jen Peart, and Jen is our Northern Development Officer based in Injune in Queensland. So, g'day, Jen.
Hi, Jake. How are you going this evening, mate?
Very well, thank you. Very well. I should add that I'm at the other end of the country in Narracourt in South Australia. So hopefully the internet holds up and we can connect with you all tonight. So just a bit about the purpose of Angus Essentials. Really, this is designed, this information, for people that might be particularly new to registered cattle, or they might even just be new to breeding cattle full stop. So this is really a one-stop shop to get some of that fundamental understanding that that'll be so important in your journey as cattle breeders. And I might also add that there'll be some nice hints and tips throughout the series for some of our more established members and cattle breeders as well. Just to let you all know that we are recording this session tonight, and if any of your friends or colleagues or fellow breeders across the industry missed tonight's webinar, this will be available on the Angus Australia YouTube channel in the near future. Questions, we certainly do welcome questions tonight. And we do have a small pause, which is partway through the presentation, and certainly like to take your questions then. Alternatively, please put them into the chat, and Jen will be monitoring the chat for us tonight, which is great. Or raise your hand, which is one of the functions on the Zoom controls. And of course, we'll have a question time for Q&A at the end of this webinar. Also, we'll have a small poll at the end of the webinar, which is really about your feedback. And there's just a few questions in there that are really essential for how we put this webinar together, some of the content, and how we might be able to improve that into the future. So we'd really appreciate if you could do the poll when it comes up, which will be towards the end of the webinar. And we'll also be providing you some dates to save in your calendar for the upcoming Angus Essentials webinar series as well. So without any further ado, we might kick off. And for part of this presentation, it is actually pre-recorded, but we'll be able to pause at the appropriate time and gather your questions and interact with you all tonight. So thanks for joining us. G'day everyone, my name is Jake Phillips. I'm the National Extension Manager for Angus Australia. And I am delighted to welcome you along to the first of our webinars in the Angus Essentials webinar series. Tonight we're going to be going through some concepts and some high-level knowledge around breeding and genetics, and how we've got to the stage we are in the beef breeding industry, where we can utilize genetic tools. And we're just going to take it back a step and circle right back to the start around understanding how genetics work and the role that they play within our breeding systems. So this is the first of the 7 webinars that we're going to be rolling out over the next few months. And we're going to be starting with more of an influence and focus on the genetics at play in the first of these webinars tonight. So with the background to genetics, I just think it's important to ask for initially, what factors determine how an animal looks and performs? Now, a lot of people will have their own thoughts and experiences as to what contributes to animal performance, and even the definition of performance can vary. But what pretty much stays the same, is that we've got strong environmental influences around things like nutrition, the climate, the management strategies, the health and the age of the animal. And they really will drive how an animal looks on any one particular day. They're going to be very considerable in all of the influencing factors. And we describe these as being non-genetic influences on how that animal performs. But importantly, we've then also got DNA and the genes that the animal carries, and we can refer to this as genetics. And they actually describe a fair bit of the difference in performance between animals, particularly when they're run in the same environment. So one of the principles of breeding and genetics to understand is that the performance of an animal really comes from the genetics and the environment working together. Now, as you can see in this example, the graphic that we've got, the two bulls at the top, bull A and bull B, are in very different environments. We've got one bull, which is bull A, in a environment with plenty of nutrition, lovely amounts of green feed there, and obviously he is representing himself to look, bigger, heavier, potentially fatter, and certainly in more of a prime condition. We've then got bull B, who's obviously doesn't have that available nutrition, and you can see in him that he's more slight built. He's probably not carrying the condition of bull A, and so the environments are really dictating how those two bulls look on any one particular day. That's called the environmental influence. However, what's really critical here is that the genetics that they're going to pass on to their progeny are not dictated by their environment. And so we can actually see that the progeny that come from bull B are actually heavier than bull A when those progeny are raised in the same environment. And this is what we call genetic influence. So really the concept that we're showing here is that in buying a breeding animal, you're buying a package of genes. Just because the animal looks a certain way, we need to establish that we're actually buying the genetic package there, and particularly is going to be important when considering what are they going to be passing on to their progeny. So one of the things that has led to the cattle industry being able to evolve over time is that we've got variation within cattle. We've also got variation within lots of things in life, and most plants and animal species exhibit plenty of variation that we can try and harness in a good way to become more productive and create more food and more protein and ultimately more profitability for farming enterprises. And so where variation exists, we can select for it. And obviously across the canine world, we've got plenty of variation. And some of these animals have been selected for jobs such as hunting or working dogs. Obviously there's some companion dogs, there's retrieving dogs, there's dogs with particular skills around sensory and search dogs and things like that. And so it comes as no surprise that we can also do that with other species. In this particular trial from North America, we've got different lines of growth rates and ultimate live weights of animals. And what we can see across these two lines from this trial back in 2006 is that across the nearly 40 generations of these two chickens, we've actually been able to increase the live weight by 6-fold. And so the difference at that 56-day weight is absolutely huge, and that is just really harnessing the variation that already existed within those genetic populations. And this is a similar example showing from meat chickens just what the constitution of that carcass and ultimate carcass weight has been able to do across using modern genetics, where we've been able to harness that variation and really hone in on the economic traits that are important to that production system. Now, bringing it back to cattle, and Angus cattle particularly, we've also seen variation across the years in beef cattle, and from 1940 to 2020, in those 80 odd years, we've seen plenty of variation in the types of Angus cattle and certainly the traits that they exhibit. And I could have found more extreme examples than this, but you can see the subtle differences from 1940 to 1950 in terms of the moderation and carcass weight, which is obvious, and then through to 2020, which is certainly more of a modern day looking beef animal.
And the numbers support our observations. So when we ask ourselves what has happened to the weight of cattle over the last 20 odd years since the millennium, since the year 2000 through to the year 2020, the Australian Angus cattle population for yearling weight, so roughly at 400 days, has actually increased by 40 kilos in that time. And this is based on the submissions by our members on the data being submitted to the TASE analysis to generate EBV. So this is real paddock records being submitted. And really what that equates to is an increase of 2 kilograms per year on average. So we're certainly harnessing that variation and driving our cattle to be heavier and therefore worth more. There is probably a clause in here that the efficiency it takes to do that in terms of feed consumed is another story, but in terms of the genetic variation and being able to harness that for more growth and more weight, we've certainly been able to do that in Australian Angus cattle as well. And there's plenty of variation across the world in beef animals. We can see across these 4 breeds here, there's differences in colour, differences in coat, differences in muscularity and expression. And so where variation exists in performance of animals due to their genetics, we can certainly harness that to create some inroads into the economic drivers of what's important to our business. Might just pause there for a moment just to see if there's any questions.
If there's no questions, we'll keep powering along.
If not, we'll keep progressing. So just wanted to bring it a bit more into focus now for real considerations for a breeding program. One of the first considerations of a breeding program is around breed, and that would be because the breed has the ability to provide optimum performance for your production system, and you'd be considering that around the environment and other constraining factors that you might have on your particular farm. One of the other questions to really be answered before we knuckle down and decide where we fit is understanding where you fit within the breed. And the first part there really is of any breeding enterprises of most species, but particularly beef cattle, there's a nucleus herd. And that's really a herd that focuses on the production of elite sires from internally bred parents. And these operations are typically very large, and because of their size, they have minimal need to purchase in new genetics. They can always find an outcross within their population. Where a lot of Angus members fit in is into the multiply category, and that really is around people that purchase nucleus sires, or they might use artificial insemination within their herd, and they play a really critical role in driving genetic progress within the industry as they increase the influence of particular sires that come out of the nucleus. And then probably the largest category is around that commercial operation, where they purchase registered bulls. They may also do some commercial AI programs, and they may also be self-replacing, but effectively they are breeding commercial beef animals to supply to the supply chain to provide beef into feedlots, processing companies, branded beef programs, and so on. So let's just take a look at the pure breeding versus crossbreeding strategy and some of the considerations that a person might make as to which one suits them better. So in a pure breeding beef herd, it is probably the simplest breeding option, and that's because generally similar bulls can be used over heifers and cows. Herds are likely to be self-replacing, so keeping heifers out of what you're doing on the farm. And there's also some premiums that do exist for purebred Angus progeny, whether it be into branded beef programs or also as pregnancy tested in calf females, both heifers and cows, to supply to other crossbreeding herds. But attention needs to be placed on selecting genetically superior animals to make sure that we maintain genetic improvement and reducing inbreeding instances. So just to put that into a different graphic, this is generally what the purebred mating decision is like. An Angus cow and an Angus bull, and the combination of those genetics will get passed on to the progeny. Of course, 50% coming from the dam, 50% coming from the sire, and the combination of those genes then filtering down and being inherited by each of the progeny. A crossbreeding strategy, in comparison, relies heavily on hybrid vigour, and the hybrid vigour can increase performance of some traits, such as weight gain, in the initial F1 progeny. Now, that strongest advantage of hybrid vigour will likely be in the F1, or which is the first cross, and the progeny will display more variation due to increased variation in genetics being used, particularly given that you're likely to be using a couple of different breeds. And it relies on purebred females to continue to be contributing to the program, which means that you either need to keep them as a separate breeding herd, which takes up space and resources, or you actually need to be purchasing those in. And traditionally, this kind of operation probably suits a terminal operation where all progeny are sold in order to capture the most value. And just to put that into a different perspective, again, this is the crossbreeding mating decision where you've got a pure breed in bull, a pure breed of bull in bull A there, and then a pure breed of cow in B, and then the resulting progeny inherits 50% of the genes from breed A and 50% of the genes from breed B. We'll also see some herds across the country form a rotational crossbreeding strategy, where a pure breed of cow and bull normally commence the breeding strategy, but then as the generations continue on through the years, we actually take different progeny from that cross and cross them back to each other. So as we can see in this example, we get to a stage where the F2 progeny are actually 75% breed content of breed A, or B in this case, and 25% of breed A. And by the third generation, they're 62.5% breed A and 37.5% breed B, all the way through until that stabilizes by the time we get through to the fourth and fifth generations. And then once that crossbreeding strategy stabilizes, we can form what's called a composite crossbreeding strategy. And many herds, particularly in Northern Australia, as well as some in the South, will adopt this kind of breeding philosophy around the heterosis and also the ability to bring in positive traits and genetics from a variety of breeds. I suppose where the complication comes, and as you can see with the resulting progeny on the right hand side of the slide, there is actually a number of breeds made up in the percentage of that animal, and that's because we've started with 4 different breeds back right in step 1 for the original mating. So there is some considerations and complications around managing this cow herd, particularly when replacement females are going to be coming from the herd. So this is likely what self-replacing versus terminal looks like in terms of a production system, where in the self-replacing you will be retaining some animals, and that may be keeping some bulls, but more than likely retaining females to be self-replacing. And in the terminal situation, where you're selling pretty much all of the progeny as beef commercial animals. So some of the take-home messages about these breeding considerations really is, for self-replacing, it requires a balanced approach. It will include emphasis on fertility and cost of production as well, as some of the considerations around management, constraints of cows, and including feed requirements. And realistically, the genetic improvement will be achievable with each generation. So you can really make some inroads into direction of your herd by this self-replacing nature. In comparison, the terminal situation, all progeny are sold, and traits important to the destination market are critical here, as you're selling all of the progeny. And genetic improvement in the herd is nearly solely reliant on the purchased females, because you're not keeping any of those genetics that you're using within the herd. So just to change gears a little bit, we might just summarize the value of actually having registered cattle, and particularly registered Angus cattle. So with a registered animal, we've got the ability to have genetics analysed in one of the leading genetic evaluations in the world, which is the TACE analysis. And we'll circle back to that in future webinars in the Angus Essential series. And we can also have the sire dam verified by DNA. So we can submit DNA on a calf, and so long as that sire and or dam have got DNA on file in our database, we can actually tell you who the sire and dam is, which is a really nice quality assurance step in the stud puzzle of registered cattle. We've also got performance information compared to more than 2 million Angus cattle in the TACE analysis every fortnight of the year, which is a huge advantage in getting a very nice objective evaluation done on the value that those cattle are bringing to your breeding program. We also have known genetic disorders that can be tested for because we know the pedigree, and we can also have DNA on file to test them objectively. And we're also really confident in the genetics that they are predictable because they're getting compared to more than 2 million Angus cattle in the TACE evaluation. So it's a really powerful data set and a powerful evaluation that is recognised across the world. On the other hand, for unregistered cattle, there's some merit that they might be able to contribute, but really it's unknown, as we don't know who they are. We've got no guarantees about their parentage, and we've also got no information about what genetics they're carrying. And so we can't compare them against other animals and other genetics. We can't guarantee the parentage, and realistically, we're unknown if they are carrying any genetic disorders. So there's a lot of grey in that space, and I would certainly question the value that they can bring to a self-replacing herd. So one of the next things I want to move into is starting to define your market that you're trying to breed for, and that will then lead into our breeding objective. So one of the questions that we might ask ourselves is, which market am I aiming for? And that really should be clear. That doesn't necessarily mean that you are focusing on supplying the feedlot market or the supermarket or the grain-fed market, but you could also be focusing on the self-replacing market. So an option here might be that you aren't going to align yourself with any one market, you're just going to breed good cattle to suit a range of markets, but you really need to define that right from the start. So which production traits are you going to be your highest priority? Are you self-replacing or terminal? That's probably a really good place to start. Are you a grass feeder operation, or will you be supplying genetics for people that are producing export finished cattle, heavy grass-fed cattle, grain-fed cattle, whatever it might be? So where do I need to focus first, and how will I get there, and what tools are available? A lot of questions there, isn't there? So let's take a deep dive in and see what we can find. Just wanted to paint this concept to you in regards to the value chain of the product and the feedback. So if we look at the product to start with, which is the blue line, we've got our cow-calf breeders around Australia, and they supply cattle to the marketplace, whether it be sale yards or direct to processors, feedlots, doesn't really matter. They go to the market. They're then value added and created into commercial beef, which means they've gone through the feedlotting process. They might enter a brand of beef value chain. They might go to a backgrounding operation where they finish them in a grass-fed claim. There's a lot of different options there, but eventually they do all end up at the processor, and that processor has direct links to the consumer. That's generally the supply of beef. That's generally the process it follows. However, the money and the feedback on that beef actually works in reverse. And every dollar in the industry ultimately comes from the consumer. It comes out of mums and dads putting their hands in their pockets to buy beef for their family meal, for their burger on the way home from footy, for their special steak, for their roast beef, whatever it might be. It comes from mum and dads putting their hand in their pocket to buy that beef. Now, feedback on that beef, both on quality, value, price, all of those things, gets passed on to the processor initially, which then gets passed on to the people value adding. It then is felt by the marketplace and then also by the breeder. And so this is a really good concept to get your head around, that the beef goes from the breeder through these different touch points along industry to the consumer ultimately. But the feedback from the consumer generally works in reverse along the same value chain. So with that in mind, we can really start to consider some of these specifications when we're supplying the market, that they are actually linked to the consumer. For example, this table on the left-hand side, supplied by the New South Wales DPI, shows us an indication of the different carcass weights, different live weights and different fat scores that would be reflective of a typical specification for that category, such as supplying a butcher, a supermarket, a Meat Centres Australia grid, an EU export grid, and also some of the feedlot grids in short to mid-term and long-fed. So typically, as the cattle get heavier, they also require more fat. Similarly, if we look across to the right-hand side, which is feeder categories, and this has come from the Meat and Livestock Australia More Beef for Profit module, and again, just a snapshot of feedlot entry categories, and we've got cattle that can range from 250 kilos up to 600 kilos live weight. There's different categories around dentition, condition scoring, expected muscle score, and so generally there is a home for most types and weights of cattle, but there'll be different price signals associated with each of these categories. So this would be really something to get our heads around when trying to define what we are actually breeding for. And once we've done that, probably the next question to ask ourselves is, do we lack genetic potential? Or can we actually make improvements through other areas? Is genetic improvement the most profitable and effective way to achieve these gains? And I come back to a example of the Livestock barrel, which really is referring to how performance is affected not by the most abundant resource, but by the most efficient one. And so if we use the example of cattle going into a feedlot where they're supplied beautiful nutrition, which is hand delivered 2 or 3 times a day, the cattle are never they're never hungry. They've got a detailed ration by ruminant scientists that dial in exactly what these animals need. One of the most limiting factors there is the genetics, because the nutrition is optimum. It is absolutely spot on. Alternatively, if we think about areas around Australia or in drought years potentially, where we might have some of the most superior genetics in the world, if we unfortunately can't get the adequate nutrition in front of those cattle, the most limiting factor there will actually be the environment. So it's important to recognize that you might have times of the year, but even just generally, ask yourself, do you lack genetic potential, or is it something actually environmental that I can make the biggest gains in first? Once you've defined your production goal, and I've got 3 examples here, the first of which is someone wanting to increase the weight in their sale cattle. For example, their weaners, they supply a weaner market and they want to have heavier weaners. Then selecting on traits such as higher 200-day growth EBVs will indicate that the progeny of that bull that you've used are expected to be heavier in live weight at approximately 200 days of age. Similarly, in a self-replacing herd, you could also use a higher milk EBV, and that will indicate that the animal is expected to produce daughters that have heavier calves at 200 days of age. So there's some direct linkage through to estimated breeding values, and we'll circle back to estimated breeding values in future webinars as part of this Angus Essential series. But I just wanted to cap that off tonight, just to give you an example that once we've defined our production goals, there will be tools available to help us control those production goals and achieve them. Another example would be increasing marbling scores in finished cattle, and something like the higher IMF EBV will indicate that the animal is expected to produce progeny with a higher percentage of intramuscular fat, or having a more uniform calf crop in age, so reducing the amount of variation in age which is in the calf crop, which will default make them more consistent. And something like selecting on the days to calving EBV will decrease the duration of time it takes for cows to conceive to the bull from the first opportunity from being joined. And really, in any clear breeding program, it is important to have a clear breeding objective. So it can also be described as having clear breeding goals or direction. And this is really about having an approach to setting a successful breeding objective. So these are some steps that may well work for you. Realistically, start with listing the traits of economic importance. What traits are economically important to your business? List your future customers' requirements, because I suppose just consider that when we make breeding decisions, it's all about the future. If we made a cow today, before we've got a weaner, it's going to be the best part of 18 months. So by the time they actually then enter the marketplace as a yearling or as a 2-year-old, it's really going to be 2 to 3 years from today's decisions. So that's why we need to consider the future customers' requirements. We need to also list our future herd production targets. How much would we like to be doing in terms of weight, calves sold, calves born in the first cycle, in terms of the cow's exposure to the bull, so on and so forth. And then we can compare this list to our current performance. And what this will establish is a gap in our current performance compared to where we want to be. Some things might have a larger gap, some things are going to be reasonably close. And then once we've defined that gap, we can start to define our breeding goals to start to bridge the gap and make some inroads in those areas that we've identified. And we can list our criteria for selecting replacements. And then we can prioritize our selection criteria. What are our top 3 to 5 traits of most importance that are really going to be non-negotiables for the foreseeable future? And where do our preferences lie? Because we may have to compromise in some of our selections. And most importantly, apply patience and consistency in the implementation of the breeding program. So just some advice on why many breeders, or sometimes in fact breeds, fail to benefit from genetic improvement. The first of all is that they have inadequate breeding objectives. They're not objective, they may be subjective, hard to measure, potentially not heritable. They've really struggled to define that breeding objective for their herd. Occasionally, some of the information also is not that useful. There may be plenty at hand that can be viewed and looked at and understood, but if it's difficult or not appropriate to be implemented into a breeding program, then that can be a bit of a handbrake on progress as well. We've also got the inadequate use of information available, and really that ties into a lack of patience and consistency in the approach to breeding and genetics. Breeding and genetics is a slow burn. There's some really big gains that can be made, but that's over a longer period of time. And so it takes a real amount of dedication to the program to make sure that we've got that patience and consistency in our approach. So just a reminder, a breeding objective really is about clearly defining the goals for improvement within the breeding program. And it should be fundamental to the breeding program and selection decisions made by the program. And ultimately, we're looking for 3 to 5 traits of the greatest importance to improve in first. You'll review this in time, because if you're doing the due diligence on the breeding objective, we will actually start to achieve some of these goals as time prevails. And so we will need to evolve the breeding objective as we start to achieve some of these production goals. We recently surveyed 20 young beef cattle enthusiasts in the Angus breed and around what their breeding objective is, and these are some of the things that they told us and that they appear in their breeding statement around their breeding objective. And many of these might also refer to things that appear in your breeding objective as well. But just a word of advice. Words such as productive, profitable, good doing, functional, easy care, doability, moderate, sound, deep, they're not objective. They're nice terms to use, but they're really difficult to impossible to actually measure objectively. So if we transfer some of those subjective terms into words such as calving ease, marbling, MSA index, sale weight, fat thickness, structural scores, these are objective. We can measure them in time. We can get a good idea of where we currently are and where we can move to. So that can actually really help us. And so really the question here is, can you measure the items in your breeding objective and are they heritable? Of course, if you don't measure them, you can't improve them. So just quickly, as I suppose an overarching statement, pretty much the quickest way to get genetic change into your breeding herd is through the bull, particularly commercially. The bull is likely to have far more calves than any one female in any year, and it's that very simple analogy which makes the bull having the most influence over the genetic direction of your herd. There's a problem with that though. We can't see the bull's genes. However, we do have estimated breeding values. And again, this is going to be a major focus of webinar number 3 coming up in the webinar series for Angus Essentials. Effectively, within the genetics within a herd, we have this bell curve distribution of progeny performance. And so we've got animals to the right there which sit in the top percentiles or the top threshold of genetic merit for certain traits. We've got a larger number of animals that sit closer to the average of the herd or indeed average of the breed, and then we've also got fewer animals that sit in the less desirable side of that bell curve, which is on the left hand side. So really the concept that we're trying to show here is that for those traits that are important to you, selecting animals from the right of this graph which are superior for genetic merit will ultimately start to drag the average up of your bell curve, which is the average of your herd or in fact the breed. And that's really the concept that we're trying to show here, is that selecting from the right on the traits that are important will start to create genetic gains that are important to your herd and indeed your business. So some of the tools available for breeders to improve include estimated breeding values, and just quickly, an estimated breeding value is an animal's breeding value and it can be defined as their genetic merit for that trait. They're also expressed as the difference between an individual's genetics and a historical genetic level, and they're reported in the units for which they're measured. So for weight, they're reported in kilograms. For fat measurements, they're reported in millimeters. For eye muscle area, for example, they're reported in square centimeters of EMA, and across those more than 20 standard reported traits, they're all reported in values that are relevant to what the actual measurement is. We'll also use these to compare the performance differences observed in the progeny, and I probably should have had that bold, highlighted, underlined, circled, flying in, because that's a critical point here. Estimated breeding values are used to compare the differences in performance of the progeny. That's what they are. They belong to the progeny. Really critical piece. So look, just to wrap up, before we move into question time, which I know that you are all looking forward to, in upcoming Angus Essential webinars, we're going to have hints on record keeping, registering Angus cattle, identification requirements. We're going to have a how-to guide on registering your calves, some hints and tips on the female inventory, and some of the registers of Angus Australia as well, because that's really critical to that registration and registered cattle piece before we move back into some of the breeding and genetic decision making type topics, which will appear in webinars 3 and 4 coming up. So other webinars that we've got the Trans-Tasman Angus cattle evaluation in June, a whole session dedicated to genomics in July. The 10th of August, we've got the utilising Angus Select and finding cattle and genetics using the Angus tech platform. And in September, we're going to be covering a really exciting session on running a successful artificial insemination program and some hints and tips from some of the industry leaders in that space. And to round out the series, we're going to be finishing off with some marketing and communication strategies delivered by some of the Angus Australia team, including some hints and tips on getting ready for sale time. So look, just some take-home messages on tonight's session. The performance of an animal is definitely influenced by genetics and the environment. That's a really key fundamental piece to understanding how genetics work. And when variation occurs, we can select on this to improve performance. We can then design a program to suit our environment and our markets that we're aiming for. We can create some production goals. We can define our breeding objective. And that really is around 3 to 5 traits of highest importance economically and that we would like to achieve first. And we need to stay committed and focused on our objective. As soon as we start to follow yearly or seasonal fads, we can really start to undo some of the good work and foundations that we've been laying down. And the bull will have the greatest influence on the genetics of a commercial cow herd. That's a key piece as well. Utilize the bull for what he is, and that is really going to be the catalyst for genetic gain. So just before we wrap up for tonight and take some questions, just wanted to remind everyone that we will be getting you a survey link to just provide us some simple feedback on tonight's session. And it's really around this concept of if we get some good quality feedback from you, we can certainly review that and we can respond to that positively and follow up on it and make future webinars and interaction with our members with even better results. So look forward to your feedback. So that brings us to the end of tonight's webinar, but this would be the perfect chance for you to express any points of further clarification that you require, or if you've got any questions that we can provide answers for now, or we can certainly follow up on it and get back to you on. But thank you very much for logging in and joining us tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure, and look forward to any questions. Pop them in the chat or place your raise your hand on the Zoom icon, or take yourself off mute. Thank you very much, guys, and happy to take questions now.
All right, guys, thanks for joining us. So we'll just get the polls up if that can if you guys can have a bit of a go at contributing to the few questions that we've got in the poll. That would be very much appreciated. And starting to see a few results come in now. I've got a comment from Marion there. Great session. I'm really looking forward to the future sessions. So thanks, Marion. That's great feedback. Got any questions in the chat there, Jen, have we tonight?
There's a few coming through, Jake, mostly just feedback saying that they got a lot from this. And yes, Marion said about how she's looking forward to future sessions. So thank you so much for joining us. Brilliant feedback saying that she'd like to see basics like branding, gears and colours covered as well, which is something we're looking at.
Yep.
Jake, one of the questions that I get a lot from members is that they've decided that they would like to go down the path of getting a bit more direction behind their breeding decisions. And we're going to cover this in the next webinar, but do you just want to touch on some of the avenues to registering animals to get EBVs and maybe some of the commercial options that are available?
Yeah, for sure. So if you're a commercial breeder and interested in getting some EBVs on your animals, we're going to be covering that in the next webinar series. But I suppose just to bring that into context for tonight, so Angus Australia do have a few different registrars or types of registrations of animals. And the vast majority of those, once we get some pedigree and age information around an animal, we can actually start to include them into our TACE analysis. We also do for registered animals have the ability to use genomic information and also physical measurements of those cattle over the course of their life. And the more information that we submit on those animals into the evaluation, the more information that we'll get out in terms of the EBVs. So that's kind of how the registration process works, and we'll cover that in the upcoming sessions. Commercially, if you don't have registered cattle and that isn't necessarily your objective, but you just want some information on your commercial, say, replacement females that you might be trying to select which ones are going to bring the best genetic merit to your herd. Angus Australia does have a product called Heifer Select, which is a commercial genomic test, and we can actually get some breeding information and some genetic merit information on different traits on those unregistered animals. They do have to be Angus animals, I might add with that, but there is a couple of options. And if you would like to discuss any of those options further, both Jen and myself would be happy to talk to you individually offline about those, because we'd be more than happy to help.
Perfect. Mark has a question, and he has asked, how is it that EBVs start to record even based on just an initial birth weight without other traits recorded?
That's a great question. So EBVs will start to get calculated as soon as we've got a pedigree in the system. And what happens from there is that if there's enough information that's been recorded on the sire and on the dam historically, there's a good chance that some of the traits will actually meet a minimum threshold of accuracy to actually start to be reported. And that's just on being who the baby is, who's the calf, and who the sire and who the dam is. And that's what we call a mid-parent value. When we start to get information recorded, such as a birth weight, there's actually correlations to some of the other traits, and birth weight and some of the other weight traits, such as 200-day weight, which is maybe weaning weight, some people might refer to 400-day weight or yearling weight, are actually correlated to birth weight. So the way that the system will work is we'll look at what has been submitted, and it will actually calculate a prediction on what the next weight will be in that animal's life. Now, that will only get more accurate with the more information that's submitted. So I would say that if you're getting EBVs on your animals from only having a birth weight recorded, that will actually become far more accurate, and indeed probably change a little bit as you start to submit more information as the animal gets older. So that was a great question. Generally, most of our traits, you do have to submit some data for to get them fully showing, or have a genomically enhanced set of EBVs. And the other thing I would add is that generally the cutoff between an EBV being displayed or not is around 35% accuracy. So if you're using sires that are well used, you'll probably get most of the more than 20 EBVs being published on your animals.
Perfect. There's no more questions at the moment. Does anyone have some? Remember, you can throw up your hand and I can unmute you if you'd prefer to ask your question in person. Mark said thank you. No worries, Mark. Hope it's helpful. I'll just give you guys a few more minutes to think of anything that you'd like to ask Jake or myself. But in the meantime, thank you so much. It's so lovely having such a engaged group. So yeah, we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Jake, I don't think there's any more questions, so I'll hand back to you.
Great. Thanks, Jenna. Thanks for your help tonight. Just before people log out, please, any final questions, definitely ask those, but also the poll that we've still got running. We've only got 19 of the responses in, and there was more than 30 of you on tonight, so that's fantastic. So please continue to fill that feedback in. But look, sincerely, thank you for the opportunity to present this to you guys. We love doing this. We're sorry we can't do it in person at the moment, but we are working towards that. And this webinar series is just going to be one of the points that we can hopefully help you with your breeding goals and aspirations for 2022 and beyond. So thank you very much, and thanks for joining us.
Jake, there's been a flurry of questions.
Great.
Jason would like the dates of the new webinar, of the next couple of webinars sent around.
Yep.
So Jason will certainly do that. Mark has a question. What does the Angus breed consider to be benchmark weights at 200, 400 and 600 days?
Sorry, Mark, what's the question? What was the question, Jen? Sorry.
What does the Angus breed consider to be benchmark weights at 200, 400 and 600 days?
Yeah. So we don't have a physical weight that is a benchmark. So the way that the EBVs work is off a historical average, and so effectively, if you're looking at calves that were born in 2020, those EBVs will be comparable against all of those other calves born in 2020, and so I suppose the only thing that kind of gets close to a benchmark is the percentile band that the EBV sits in. And so that's all publicly available through the Angus Australia website. And so if you're looking at where an animal sits in terms of its EBVs, the 50th percentile probably goes without saying, that is halfway between the very best animals in the breed for that trait or most desirable, and the very least desirable animals in the breed for a certain trait. And so the breed average for the EBV is a really good place to start. Phenotypically, we don't necessarily present what the mean or the average weight is, because there's a fair bit of seasonal variation. And so it's only really over time that we can start to see where the trends are heading. And like in this presentation, when we spoke about the 400-day weights and how Angus cattle have been able to improve by more than 40 kilos in the last 20 years. Probably doesn't answer your question particularly, but we don't have raw performance benchmarks to qualify. It's more of the genetic merit that we're interested in, and the difference between animals, not necessarily what their raw observation is.
Don has asked, can genomic testing for a specific animal be used for revising or updating existing EBV data?
Absolutely. So the way that genomics works, and if you've got a particular interest in genomics, which I'm sure many of you do, certainly log in for the third webinar. But the way that the genomics will work is that, as we had in the initial question tonight, where we're getting EBVs reporting from who the pedigree is, and that's really the first step in EBVs, and we get some information from there about who's your mum, who's your dad. We then get a bit more information when we start to get performance information around the weights of this animal, and particularly compared to other animals in its group and on farm for that year. And then we even get more information from a genomics test. And what a genomics test does is looks at the gene markers that animal has for certain traits, and it compares them against all the other Angus cattle in the population, or in the Australian herd, and what gene markers they have. But it's only, I suppose, the caveat I would say is that the genomics piece is really important to acknowledge, that we need to have the performance records in the system to know if the gene markers or what the gene markers are indicating. So I suppose, just to digress a little bit, the Angus breed has a program called the Angus benchmarking program, which has now been going for more than 10 years. And we call that a reference population. And so what happens is that we have approximately 2,000 registered Angus calves born to between 30 and 40 bulls every year. And we measure every single trait from conception just about right through to consumption on these animals. But what's critical is we've actually got a genotype on all of those animals. And so we've intensively measured all of these traits on known cattle, and we've got a genotype. So what that means for your question is that if you then go and genotype your calf that you've got at home, that will actually be directly compared to the genetics of what we've measured in our reference population. And there's many other herds around Australia that are doing a great job of submitting performance information, and they've got a genotype as well. So it's giving us more power in terms of data and comparison than we ever have in the history of, I suppose, genetic evaluation. It's a pretty exciting space.
Perfect, Jake. I might only add to that in that, so an animal's EBVs only come from, are only generated from actual on-the-ground performance, and it's sort of sourced from 3 different areas. One is its pedigree, so think its parents, its grandparents, and also its progeny. The second being physical measurements taken on the animal itself. And then the third, and probably the newest space, which Jake has just addressed, is the genomic side of things. So looking at the actual performance of animals that are genetically related to this animal, so meaning that they share gene markers in common. So that sort of goes to inform. So every time you add more information from one of those three sources, it only increases the information that we then know on that particular animal and makes us able to predict their progeny's performance more accurately. Sorry, just jumping in there. So where are we up to? So Raylene has a question. Does the Heifer Select data go towards the registered sires summary of progeny?
That's a good question, Raylene. I don't believe it does. But what is important, I suppose, is that if the heifers are by and Jen, you might be able to confirm this, but if the heifers are by a registered Angus sire, and that registered Angus sire does have DNA on file, if you actually request that those heifers could be assessed to find out and confirm that that is the sire, that evaluation will actually do that. And we call that sire verification if it's just finding the sire. If it's the dam, we can also do dam verification with DNA as well. So you will actually get an ability to qualify and guarantee who the parent is, particularly the sire, if they have DNA on file through the Heifer Select product.
But as it stands, my understanding is that that information doesn't flow back through to the site to inform sires because it's a commercial product and they're a commercial heifer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Raylene goes on to say, it would be awesome to start seeing more commercial breeders target traits. I, as a commercial breeder, find sale yards or online auctions very unreliable to purchase good, trustworthy cattle.
Not sure if that's a question or a statement, Raylene, but I think that my comment around that is I would encourage everyone to try and chase up the feedback on the cattle that they're breeding as much as they can. And I'm not saying what price they make in the sale yards. I'm saying how did they perform for your customer? You know, in terms of their health, in terms of their growth, and particularly if you get any information from, you know, abattoirs around MSA grading is extremely powerful. And that's just another tool to put into your toolbox, I should say, in terms of making your decisions around where you're currently at. And if you think about the breeding objective that we went through tonight, part of that is around assessing where you're currently at, because that's going to be the benchmark to set your goals going forward. So I do agree with your comments for sure.
Don has a question. How do EBVs change? How does EBV data change by region, i.e. New South Wales versus WA?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We're going to delve right into the taste analysis in the webinar 3. But I suppose to answer that now, the EBV, it comes out of the taste evaluation. And what that's doing is looking for the genetic differences across animals. So it's about removing the environmental difference of the animals. So, and the way that it does that, if there's, say, genetics and particularly certain sires that are represented across multiple herds in Australia, some in Queensland, some in New South Wales, some in Western Australia, they will all have then performance records coming in on their calves into the evaluation. Now, we know there's environmental differences across those different places, but what there will also be is genetic differences. And what the evaluation does is remove the environment or the property effect, and it looks at what's left. And the vast majority of what's left is the genetic difference. And that's how we can compare EBVs across herds across Australia. I suppose coming back to genomics, the other advantage that it's done is directly compare the gene markers of the animal it's tested against the other gene markers in various herds and different locations across Australia as well. So we're really lucky that Australia has kind of been a leading genetic evaluation country, and the Angus breed has certainly been towards the pinnacle of that historically. And the great part and the point I want to make is that EBVs can be assessed within breed across properties in Australia, across herds. And that gives the commercial producer a really neat way to be able to get a benchmark, I suppose, as to what sort of sires or animals they're looking at, and whether or not they may suit their herd.
And it also goes to illustrate how important management groups are, and we'll get into that in a different webinar, but just how important management groups are, because they really inform the environmental impact that the difference in performance equates to. So yeah, that's something that we'll tackle in a different webinar. But yeah, Mark has a question. When, e.g. weight or age, do breeders generally scan for info EBV updates, and when are they generally just scanned? And are they generally just scanned once or several times? Mark, are you referring to like fat scanning and eye muscle area scanning? Are you able to? Yes. So yes, he's wanting to know when, meaning what weight or age, do breeders generally scan for info EBVs updates, and are they just generally scanned once or several times?
Yeah, so generally they're scanned once. As with most of our traits, we can accept multiple records across most of the traits, not all, but most of the traits that we do have EBVs for. However, what we'll find is normally it's the first of the trait that actually gets put into the evaluation. I would say that when you're considering when you're going to be collecting information, the question to ask yourself before that is, when do you require the updated EBV based on your new collection that you've done, say scanning for this example, and you're interested in how it's going to change the EBVs. So you're obviously going to want to be making a decision. Is that decision around replacement females, sale bulls, culls? And so as early as you can within the parameters of that trait would probably be my advice. The only caveat I'd say to that is with scanning, when the animal starts to get heavier and in a better environment and in a conditioned sense, they will start to express themselves more. But the evaluation is a pretty nifty piece of technology, and it will still pick up the differences between animals so long as they're within those parameters. I think probably, without talking particularly about scanning, it might be a good time to mention that the Angus Education Centre, Jen, on the Angus Australia website, there is actually a link to a guide to collecting performance information, and that covers off on all of our traits. It's available as a downloadable PDF, and we can certainly circulate that to this audience tonight via email, and that will give you a really good idea of, I suppose, the collection protocols and parameters for all of the traits that we report EBVs for.
Perfect. Mark says, makes sense, thank you. That was my last question. Good session. Thanks so much for your questions, everyone. They've been fantastic.
Great. Righto, well, if that's it, thank you everyone for joining us. We've had an absolute ball hosting our first webinar for 2022. A few more to come, but look, it's been great. Thanks again, and if there's anything we can help you with in the meantime, please give myself a call, Jake Phillips at Angus Australia, or Jen Peart, and we'll be able to point you in the right direction for sure. So enjoy your night, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks everyone.